You weren't invited to dinner, my wife doesn't want you there. But I read the text 3 times, standing in my kitchen, still wearing the apron I'd put on to bake his favorite apple pie, the one I made every Sunday for 31 years. That was the moment everything changed. My name is Gerald Malone. I'm 63 years old, a retired high school history teacher, a widower of 4 years, and until that Sunday afternoon, a man who believed, with every fiber of his being, that he had done right by his son. The text from Daniel came at 3:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I had just glanced at the clock, calculating whether the pie would be done before I needed to leave for his house. We had a standing Sunday dinner, 18 years of it, first when he was a boy, then through college when he'd drive the 2 hours home just for that meal, then through his 20s when he lived across town, and then even after he married Priscilla 4 years ago. 18 years. The text said, "Dad, you weren't invited to dinner tonight. Priscilla doesn't want you there, don't come." No explanation, no softening, just 12 words dropped like stones into still water. I set my phone down on the counter. The oven ticked. The smell of cinnamon and brown sugar filled the kitchen, the same smell that had filled every kitchen we'd ever lived in, every Sunday, since Daniel was old enough to pull a chair up to the counter and help me peel apples. His mother's recipe, always his mother's recipe. I didn't cry right away. I'm not sure I was capable of it in that first moment. I just stood there, a 63-year-old man in an apron, feeling something hollow open up in the center of my chest. I turned off the oven. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had done homework, where we'd played cards on rainy afternoons, where I had sat with him the night his mother died and held his hand while he wept, and I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Priscilla, I had tried with Priscilla. God knows I had tried. She was a sharp woman, intelligent and capable, and Daniel loved her with a kind of quiet ferocity that reminded me of how I had loved his mother. I respected that. I welcomed her into our family with open arms. When Daniel proposed, I took her out for coffee and told her that she wasn't just gaining a husband, she was gaining a father if she wanted one. She had smiled politely and said thank you. That was 4 years ago. I think, looking back, that I missed the signs. Or perhaps I saw them and chose to interpret them charitably because Daniel was happy, and Daniel's happiness had always been the North Star I navigated by. Little things, Priscilla correcting me at dinner when I told a story she'd heard before, saying, "That's not how Daniel told it." Priscilla going quiet when I called Daniel on a Tuesday evening just to chat. Priscilla's suggestions that Daniel and I reduce our Sunday dinners from weekly to monthly to give you both space, she said, though neither of us had asked for space. I had accommodated, I had adjusted. I had bitten my tongue more times than I could count, not out of weakness, but because I understood that marriage is sacred and a son's loyalty must shift. That is the natural order. I had been married. I knew what it meant to build a life with someone, to create a home that was yours and yours alone. But I thought we had found a balance. I thought we were fine. The text told me we were not fine. I sat at that table for a long time, long enough for the kitchen to cool, long enough for the untouched pie to sink in its pan, long enough for the sun to drop behind the neighbor's oak tree and throw long shadows through the window. Then I did something that surprised even me. I didn't call Daniel in anger. I didn't fire back a wounded reply. I didn't call his aunts or his cousins to share my grievance. I had seen that road before. I'd watched other families splinter along exactly those fault lines, and I knew where it led. Instead, I took out a legal pad and a pen, the old-fashioned way, and I started to write. Not to Daniel, to myself. I wrote down every Sunday dinner I could remember, not to catalogue my sacrifice or build a case, but because I genuinely wanted to see what those dinners had been, what they'd meant, whether they had perhaps, somewhere along the way, stopped being about love and started being about habit, about my need rather than his. I wrote for 2 hours. What I found, if I was honest, and I forced myself to be honest, was complicated. Yes, those dinners were love. Yes, they were tradition and connection and the thread that kept us tethered to his mother's memory. But I also found, buried in my own handwriting, evidence that I had not always been easy, that I had sometimes offered opinions about their marriage when none were sought, that I had called Daniel's phone when I knew they were traveling together, that I had once shown up unannounced on a Wednesday evening because I happened to be in the neighborhood, which was not entirely true. I was not the villain of this story, but I was not entirely blameless either. The following morning, I called Daniel, not to fight, not to demand an explanation, though I believe I deserved one. I called because he was my son, and 31 years of loving someone earns you the right to ask one simple question. "Are you all right?" I said when he answered. Silence, then, "Dad, I'm not calling to argue," I said. "I just want to know that you're all right." Another silence, longer, and then he said very quietly, "I don't know, Dad, I honestly don't know." That's when I knew the text had not been entirely Priscilla's doing. Something was fracturing inside my son's life, and he didn't know how to show me without shutting me out first. We talked for an hour, not about the text, not about the dinner, not about Priscilla. We talked about his mother, about the apple pie, about a fishing trip we took when he was 9, just the two of us, and how he caught a bass and was so proud he made me take 4 rolls of film photographing it before he threw it back. Before we hung up, I said, "Whatever is happening in your home, Daniel, is your business. I'll respect that, but I want you to know that my door is open, not because you owe me anything, because I love you." He said, "I know, Dad, I know." 3 weeks passed. The Sunday dinners stayed paused. I filled the time differently, started volunteering at the library on Sunday afternoons, reading to kids in the children's section. It helped more than I expected. Then one Saturday morning, my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Priscilla standing on my porch alone. No Daniel, just Priscilla, with her dark hair pulled back and something unfamiliar in her expression, something stripped of its usual armor. "Can I come in?" she said. I stepped back and held the door open. She sat at my kitchen table, that same table, and she talked for almost an hour, about her own father, who she hadn't spoken to in 11 years, about how she didn't know what a good father-in-law was supposed to look like because she'd never had one, about how my closeness with Daniel had felt, to her, less like love and more like a rope she feared would one day pull him away from her, about how the text had been born in a moment of fear, not malice, and how she had regretted it almost immediately but didn't know how to unsend 12 words. I listened, I didn't interrupt, I didn't defend myself. When she finished, I said, "I think we may have been afraid of the same thing, losing Daniel, in completely different directions." She looked at me for a long moment, then she nodded. "I'd like to try," she said, "if you're willing." I got up and put the kettle on. Then I pulled the recipe card from the drawer, his mother's handwriting, soft and looping, faded at the corners, and I set it on the table between us. "Do you know how to make an apple pie?" I asked. She shook her head. "Then let's start there," I said. Daniel came home to find us in the kitchen, flour on the counter, the smell of cinnamon filling the house. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at us, his wife, his father, standing side by side at a counter that had held 31 years of Sundays. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just walked in, rolled up his sleeves, and asked what he could do to help. The pie, when we finally sat down to eat it, was imperfect. The crust was slightly overdone on one side. Priscilla had added a touch too much nutmeg. It was the best one I'd ever tasted. Some doors close hard, but if you don't meet them with matching force, if you stay soft, stay open, stay willing, sometimes they open again. And sometimes what comes through isn't what you lost. It's something better, something new. Something worth every silent, patient minute of the waiting.